This class explains how to draw partial Jacquard with Renan knit design system, divided into the following 3 parts. Part 1, ordinary partial Jacquard. Part 2, complex partial Jacquard. Part 3, compile parameters with partial Jacquard. Part 1, ordinary partial Jacquard. It refers to common simple partial Jacquard. For example, I want to design a logo here with partial Jacquard. The first step, draw the knitting action in the pattern layer. You can shape directly in the shape, like this front pattern. The second step, draw the yarn feeder distribution of the partial Jacquard in the intarsia layer. That is, the pattern on the front of the partial Jacquard. Select the rows of the partial Jacquard. Copy to intarsia layer. Specify the yarn feeder on the intarsia layer. Because the whole piece of cloth is knitted with number 3 yarn feeder, therefore, the number 3 yarn feeder is also used here. The logo part can be drawn with the text tool. Number 3 yarn feeder can no longer be used here. Need change a color, such as color 2. This is the knitting area of the yarn feeder. It can also be considered as yarn feeder number. Step 3. Draw the back knitting form of the partial Jacquard part in the Jacquard layer. Each back knitting form has a different representative number. It can be viewed in function line 216. Right-click and select one of the Jacquards. Each back knitting form has a different representative number. It's the previous numbers. The numbers represent the knitting form behind. For example, we want to draw a partial Jacquard with 1x on a back knitting form. Its representative number is 3. Draw the logo part in color 3 in the Jacquard layer. That is 1 by 1a. Step 4. Mark the partial Jacquard line on the function line 216. All the intarsia layer of this pattern are partial Jacquard rows, so just mark the partial Jacquard part at 216. Ordinary partial Jacquard can be marked with partial to color or partial colors. Set partial to colors here. 4 parts with partial Jacquard. Each row needs to be marked. Then group yarn feeders all into the first group. 4 parts with partial Jacquard. Each row needs to be marked. Setting the knitting form is completed. Step 5. Mark the yarn feeder number corresponding to the color in the first group of the intarsia layer. In the yarn feeder group settings, the numbers in the intarsia layer can represent the yarn feeder number, or B represent yarn feeder knitting area. If the latter one, you need to redefine the yarn feeder number in this yarn feeder group settings. You can choose automatic. What do these numbers mean? 2. The first 2 represents the area where 2 is drawn in the intarsia layer. The second 2 represents the yarn feeder number used when knitting, that is, number 2 yarn feeder. 3 is the same. The first 3 represents the area where 3 is drawn in the intarsia layer. The second 3 represents the number 3 yarn feeder used when knitting. Of course, you can define your own. For example, area 2 is biased to the right. It is recommended to knit with the 12th yarn feeder on the right. The float line with yarn will not be so long. Can be modified in yarn feeder group settings like this. Order actually change to 212 in the intarsia layer. After the modification, click Auto in the yarn feeder group setting. Let the software automatically plan the yarn feeder number and knitting sequence. Here is shown the carriage knitting from left to right. The small yarn feeder knit in front. The large yarn feeder knit at the back. This is the setup of the yarn feeder system. ordinary partial Jacquard is completed. Lesson summary. Step 1. Draw the knitting action in the pattern layer. Step 2. Draw the yarn feeder distribution of the partial Jacquard in the intarsia layer. Step 3. Draw the back knitting form of the partial Jacquard part in the Jacquard layer. Step 4. Mark the partial Jacquard line on the function line 216. If there are non-Jacquard rows in the intarsia layer, we can mark as partial Jacquard. Can also be marked as intarsia. This pattern has only partial Jacquard, so I only painted the partial Jacquard part. Step 5. Mark the yarn feeder number corresponding to the color in the first group of intarsia in the yarn feeder group setting. Compile. Compile with default parameters first. The specific parameter settings will be explained later. View the compiled knitting action file. Singer to JQD. The back knitting form with 1x1A. JQD to Singer with transfer. The number 12 yarn feeder is taken out from the right when finish is all knitting. Knitting with the number 12 yarn feeder on the right, the floating line is relatively short. If knitting with the yarn feeder on the left, the floating line is longer. The above is the 5 steps of drawing ordinary partial Jacquard.